The chase begins. The night was dark, the sky filled with strange stars. The wind howled through the tall, twisted trees, carrying the scent of blood. Nera ran. Her small feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but she did not stop. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She could hear it behind her. The predator. It was coming. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. Her body ached, her side bleeding from a deep wound. Blue blood dripped from her fingers, marking the ground. She knew the beast could smell it. She was leaving a trail. No, I can't die here. She pushed forward, her muscles screaming in pain. The trees stretched above her, their twisted branches blocking the moonlight. Shadows danced around her, but she had no time to fear them. A low, deep growl echoed through the forest. Nera's breath hitched. She looked back. Glowing red eyes. Big, cruel, and watching her. The beast was close. Then, it leaped. She screamed and threw herself to the ground. Claws slashed the air where she had stood just a second ago. Leaves exploded around her as she rolled, pushing herself up. The predator landed with a heavy thud, its massive body crushing small plants beneath its weight. Nera didn't stop. She ran. She could hear the beast breathing, hear its claws digging into the dirt as it chased her. She had no weapon, no strength left, only fear and the will to survive. Then she saw it. A cabin. It stood in the middle of a small clearing, made of dark wood and strange metal. Light flickered inside. A fire. Nera's heart leaped. Shelter. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the pain in her legs. She had never seen a structure like this before. It was not built by her people. It looked old, strange. But right now, it was her only hope. Behind her, the beast roared. So close. She pushed harder, every step bringing her closer. Her legs were weak, her vision blurry, but she reached the wooden door and slammed her fists against it. "Please," she cried. "Help me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door swung open. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, a scared face with cold eyes. A human. Nera barely had time to think before the human grabbed her arm and yanked her inside. The door slammed shut behind her. Outside, the beast roared in rage. The cabin shook as something heavy slammed against it. The walls creaked, dust falling from the ceiling. Nera collapsed on the wooden floor, gasping for air. She looked up. The human was holding something, a weapon, long and dark. His fingers tightened around it as he listened to the growls outside. For a moment, silence. Then he spoke. "You brought company." His voice was deep, rough. His eyes locked onto hers, scanning her alien features, her silver skin, glowing blue veins, and frightened eyes. Nera trembled. She had never met a human before. Her people spoke of them, but never with kindness. They were warriors, survivors, dangerous. And yet, she had no choice. She took a shaky breath. It wants to kill me." Outside, the predator scratched the walls, its claws digging into the wood. The human didn't flinch. He lifted his weapon and cocked it with a sharp click. Let it try. The human and the alien girl. Nera lay on the wooden floor, gasping for breath. Sweat dripped down her silver skin, mixing with the streaks of blue blood still flowing from the deep wound in her side. The pain pulsed with every heartbeat, sharp and relentless. The cabin smelled strange. Smoke, metal, and something else. Something human. The air was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing night outside. She had never been inside a human dwelling before. The walls were lined with tools and weapons, shelves stacked with supplies, and a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows. It was small but sturdy, a fortress in the middle of nowhere. And standing in front of her, gripping a long black weapon, was the human. Tall, muscular. His face was lined with scars. His sharp eyes locked onto her like he was assessing a threat. Nera shuddered. Was she safe here? A deep guttural growl outside reminded her that safety was an illusion. The beast was still out there. The human moved. He knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against the soaked fabric covering her wound. She flinched. "Bleeding," he muttered. His voice was rough, tired, but steady. Nira nodded weakly. "I know." His gaze flicked to her face. For a long moment, he studied her, taking in her silvery skin, the faint glow of her veins, her wide, frightened eyes. He didn't look shocked. He had seen aliens before. Outside, the beast let out a deep snarl. The cabin shook as something massive slammed against it. The walls groaned under the pressure, dust falling from the ceiling. Nira's breath caught. The human, however, didn't even flinch. He stood, walked to the window, and peeked through the wooden slats. His grip tightened on the weapon. "It's waiting." His words sent a cold chill down her spine. Waiting. Nira had heard the stories. The beast was not just strong, it was patient. It could stalk its prey for hours, even days, wearing them down until they were too weak to fight back. She swallowed hard. "It won't leave." The human didn't answer. He simply turned, grabbed a cloth from a nearby shelf, and tossed it toward her. "Wrap your wound. You'll bleed out before it gets in." Nira hesitated, but she obeyed. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the cloth against her side, hissing at the pain. The bleeding slowed, but she was still weak. She looked up at him. "Who are you?" The human exhaled, rubbing a hand over his scruffy beard. "Jack." Just one name. Short, sharp, human. Nira licked her dry lips. "Jack," she repeated. "You live here?" He gave a short nod. "For now." For now. That meant he was always moving. A wanderer. A survivor. Her gaze shifted to the walls. Rifles, knives, strange-looking devices. This was not the home of a weak creature. She had heard of humans before. Stories whispered in fear. They'd fought wars, conquered worlds, survived where others perished. And yet, here he was, in a lonely cabin on a forgotten world, saving a stranger. Another growl outside. A slow, heavy thump against the door. Jack sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Persistent thing." Nira's heart pounded. "You're not afraid of it." Jack glanced at her, then out the window. The beast's red eyes burned through the darkness, watching, studying. Then Jack smirked. "It should be afraid of me." The plan. He moved quickly, checking his supplies. He grabbed a belt of ammunition, slung another gun over his back, and pulled open a metal box filled with glowing cylinders. Nira frowned. "What are those?" "Explosives." He didn't even look up. "In case I need to blow the thing to hell." Her stomach twisted. The beast was massive, but was it really something that could be killed? "It's strong," she warned. "It won't go down easily." Jack snorted. "Neither do I." Another slam. The doorframe shook violently. Jack cursed under his breath, checking the locks. He grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle, reinforcing it. Nira's breath was shaky. How long can the walls hold? Jack was silent for a moment. Then he gave a small, grim smile. "Long enough." Nira didn't know if he was lying or not. Outside, the beast let out a deep, rumbling growl. It was getting impatient. Jack glanced at her. "You can hold a weapon." Nira hesitated. I don't know how to fight." Jack tossed her a knife anyway. It was cold, heavy, and far too large for her small hands. "If it gets in," Jack said, "don't hesitate." Nira gripped the knife tightly, her heart hammering. She had never killed anything before. But looking at Jack, his calm expression, his steady hands, she knew. He had. Many times. Another slam. Louder. Stronger. Jack cocked his gun, his jaw tightening. "It's coming." Nira swallowed hard. She could feel it in the air, the weight of something hungry, relentless. She clutched the knife, her breathing uneven. Jack glanced at her, then back at the door. Outside, the beast let out a final earth-shaking roar. And then, it attacked. The hunter's siege. The air inside the cabin grew thick with tension. The wooden walls shuddered with every impact, each slam of the beast's massive body against the door rattling the small shelter. Jack stood still, his rifle aimed at the entrance, listening. His breathing was even, his hand steady. He had faced worse. But this was different. This thing wasn't just trying to break in, it was playing with them. Testing the walls. Testing them. Nira pressed herself against the farthest corner of the room, gripping the knife Jack had given her. The blade felt too big in her small hands, its weight unfamiliar. She had never held a weapon before. And yet she knew. If the monster got inside, she would have to use it. Another slam. The door groaned. The beast was learning. Jack muttered under his breath, his fingers adjusting the strap of his rifle. He wasn't just standing there. He was thinking. Calculating. Nira could barely breathe. Jack, what do we do? Jack's eyes flicked to her, then back to the door. We hold. Nira's body ached, her wound still fresh. The cloth she had pressed against it was damp with blue blood, but the pain no longer mattered. Because something was outside. Something that wouldn't stop. The watcher in the dark. Jack took slow steps toward the window, careful not to make too much noise. He peered through a narrow gap between the wooden slats, his eyes sharp and calculating. Red eyes. Watching. The beast wasn't just attacking, it was observing. Jack's grip tightened on his gun. Smart bastard. Nira swallowed hard. It's waiting. Jack nodded. Yeah, that's the problem. The creature was learning, testing the weak spots of the cabin. It wasn't just brute force, it was hunting with patience. It could wait for hours, maybe days, until they were too weak to resist. Jack muttered a curse and stepped back from the window. We can't stay here. Nira's heart skipped a beat. We have nowhere else to go. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the table and grabbed something. A metal cylinder with a blinking red light. Nira frowned. What is that? Jack smirked. A surprise. Before she could ask more, a new sound cut through the cabin. A deep, scraping noise. Nira's body stiffened. She turned toward the ceiling, eyes wide. The sound was coming from above. It's on the roof. Jack exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He raised his rifle, his gaze flicking to the ceiling. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of something massive. Thump. Thump. The beast was climbing. Nira's breath caught in her throat. It's trying to get in from above. Jack nodded. Smart. He cocked his rifle. But not smart enough. The beast's claws dug into the wood, scraping, tearing, ripping. Dust fell from the ceiling, a few splinters dropping onto the floor. Jack stepped back, calculating. He raised the metal cylinder, the one with the blinking red light. Get ready, he said. Nira's stomach twisted. For what? Jack pulled a small trigger on the side of the device. The light turned solid red. Then he threw it. The cylinder hit the wooden ceiling with a loud thunk, rolling toward the source of the scratching. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, boom! The roof exploded. Flames erupted, chunks of wood and debris flying in every direction. The cabin shook violently, the force of the blast nearly knocking Nira off her feet. A monstrous screech filled the air. Through the gaping hole in the ceiling, the beast reeled back, smoke and fire scorching its thick armor-like skin. It snarled, its glowing red eyes filled with fury. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired. Bang! Bang! Each shot echoed in the night, bullets striking the beast's thick hide. But it wasn't enough. The creature lunged down through the broken ceiling, claws swiping at Jack. Jack barely dodged, rolling across the wooden floor as the beast landed inside the cabin. The shelter trembled under its weight. Face to face with death, Nira froze. The beast was massive, bigger than she had ever imagined. Its armored body was dark and ridged, plates overlapping like a natural exoskeleton. Its claws were as long as daggers, dripping with something thick and black. And its eyes, burning red, filled with hunger. It wanted them dead. Jack was already moving. He grabbed a knife from his belt and slashed at the beast's leg, but the blade barely left a mark. The monster roared, swinging its massive arm toward him. Jack jumped back, but not fast enough. Wham! The impact sent Jack flying across the room. He crashed into the wooden shelves, knocking weapons and supplies to the floor. Nira's breath caught. Jack! He groaned, struggling to get up. The beast turned toward her. Its red eyes locked onto her small, injured body. It lunged. A desperate choice. Nira had no time to think. She raised the knife just as the beast's claws came down. The impact threw her backward, the knife cutting deep into the creature's thick flesh. The beast let out a deafening screech, staggering for a brief moment. Jack was already moving. He grabbed a shotgun from the wreckage of the shelves and fired point-blank into the beast's side. Boom! The monster reeled back, crashing into the broken walls of the cabin. Jack didn't waste time. He grabbed Nira's wrist and pulled her up. His eyes were sharp, his voice urgent. "We run. Now." Nira's legs were weak, her wound burning, but she knew. If they stayed here, they were dead. The beast shook off the blast, its eyes burning brighter with rage. It let out a roar that shook the entire cabin. Jack pulled Nira toward the door, his grip strong. They had no choice. They had to run. And outside, in the darkness, the hunt was far from over. Breaking in. The night was alive with fire and fury. Smoke curled from the broken ceiling of the cabin, embers floating in the air like dying stars. The wind howled through the open gap where the roof once was, and the predator stood in the wreckage, its red eyes glowing with unholy hunger. Jack didn't hesitate. He yanked Nira to her feet. "Move." Her legs felt weak, her wound still bleeding, but she obeyed. She stumbled after him, heart hammering as they rushed toward the door. Behind them, the beast shook off the explosion, its massive body slamming against the broken walls. The entire cabin trembled. The wooden beams groaned, barely holding together. Jack reached the door and shoved it open. Voyez! A massive clawed hand crashed into the wall beside them, shattering the wood into splinters. Nira screamed as Jack pushed her back, barely avoiding the strike. The predator let out a guttural snarl, its massive form blocking the only exit. Smoke curled around it, giving it the illusion of a demon rising from the depths of hell. Jack clenched his jaw. They were trapped. His grip on his shotgun tightened. His mind raced. The creature had taken a direct explosion, yet it was still standing. Bullets barely slowed it down. If it got inside fully, it was over. He had fought many things in his life. He had survived wars, seen monsters worse than nightmares. But this was something different. The predator growled, stepping through the ruined doorway. The wooden floor creaked under its weight as it moved forward, slow and deliberate. It knew they had nowhere to run. Jack whispered, barely moving his lips. "Nira." She was frozen, pressed against the far wall. She clutched the knife he had given her, but it trembled in her grip. Jack's voice was low. "Stay behind me." She swallowed hard. She didn't see a way out. Neither did Jack. A desperate gamble. The beast lunged. Jack dove sideways, rolling across the floor as claws slashed through empty air. The moment it landed, he fired. Boom! A direct hit to the beast's chest. The blast sent a spray of dark blood across the wooden walls, but the predator barely staggered. Jack cursed. Not enough. It swiped again, claws tearing through the air like blades. Jack barely dodged, rolling across the floor as splinters flew. The beast turned to Nira. She was still pressed against the wall, her breath shallow. Frozen in fear, Jack didn't think. He grabbed a nearby chair and threw it as hard as he could. The wooden frame smashed against the creature's side, barely slowing it down. But it was enough. "Nira, move," Jack shouted. She blinked, then finally snapped out of her paralysis. She dove aside just as the beast struck where she had been standing. Jack grabbed his last grenade. No time to hesitate. He yanked the pin and threw it directly at the monster's head. The beast caught it. For a fraction of a second, it just stood there, holding the grenade in its massive claws. Then, boom! The explosion ripped through the cabin, sending smoke and flames in every direction. The force of the blast threw Jack and Nira backward, knocking the air from their lungs. Buried under the wreckage. For a moment, everything was silent. Jack lay on his back, his ears ringing. The world was spinning. His head throbbed. Smoke filled the air, dust swirling in the dim firelight. The cabin was nearly destroyed. Half of the roof gone. The walls cracked and broken. Jack groaned, pushing himself up. His body ached. He checked his limbs. Nothing broken. Just pain. Then he remembered. Nira. His heart lurched. Nira. His voice was hoarse. He coughed, waving the smoke away as he scanned the wreckage. Then, movement. A small, trembling figure crawled out from under a fallen beam. Nira. Jack exhaled in relief. "You alive?" She nodded weakly. I think so." He moved toward her, carefully stepping over the shattered debris. He reached out, gripping her arm to help her up. But then, a low growl. Jack froze. Nira's eyes widened in horror. They turned toward the center of the wreckage. Through the smoke and dust, something moved. The predator was still alive. The monster rises. The rubble shifted, and a deep, inhuman snarl filled the cabin. A massive shadow rose from the wreckage, its glowing red eyes burning with fury. Jack gritted his teeth. "You've got to be kidding me." The beast's armor was scorched, blackened from the explosion, but it was still standing. It turned toward them, slow and deliberate. Jack reached for his gun. Empty. He reached for his belt. No more grenades. Nothing left. The beast snarled and charged. Jack did the only thing he could. He grabbed Nira and ran. They burst through the broken cabin wall, stumbling into the cold night air. Behind them, the beast let out a roar of rage, smashing through the remains of the shelter. Jack pulled Nira along as they ran into the dark forest. The trees closed in around them, shadows stretching like claws. The beast was right behind them. And it wasn't stopping. The great escape. The forest blurred around them as they ran. The wind howled through the twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath them was rough, uneven. Nira stumbled, but Jack yanked her forward, refusing to let her fall. Behind them, the beast followed. Its massive frame crashed through the wreckage of the destroyed cabin, burning embers and splintered wood flying in every direction. It roared, the sound deep and guttural, vibrating through the night. Jack didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Heavy footsteps shook the earth, getting closer. The air smelled of burnt wood and blood, thick with smoke. Jack's body was running on pure instinct now. Survive, escape, fight later. He had fought monsters before, but nothing like this. This thing was tough, fast, and smart. Too smart. They weren't escaping. They were being herded. Nira gasped for air, her legs barely keeping up. Her wound had reopened, blue blood dripping onto the leaves. She wasn't going to last much longer. Jack cursed under his breath. They needed a plan. Fast. Then, up ahead, a break in the trees. Jack's eyes locked onto it. A canyon. A deadly trap. They burst through the last line of trees, and suddenly, the ground was gone. A sheer drop stretched before them, disappearing into darkness. The canyon was massive. its jagged edges cutting through the land like an old wound. The bottom was too far to see. If they fell, they wouldn't survive. Jack skidded to a stop, nearly pulling Nira off the edge. He steadied her with one hand and turned. The beast was already there. It stood at the tree line, watching them. It had stopped chasing. Because it knew. Jack clenched his fists. Damn it. Nira panted beside him, her eyes darting to the drop, then back to Jack. What? Now? Jack exhaled, mind racing. The beast had pushed them here on purpose. It knew the terrain better than he did. It had planned this. It wanted them cornered. And now, they were. Jack checked his gear. No more ammo. No explosives. Just a knife and an exhausted alien girl. He'd faced impossible odds before. But this was bad. The beast took a slow, deliberate step forward, its red eyes never leaving them. Jack stepped in front of Nira. Stand or fall. The predator let out a low growl, almost like a taunt. It was enjoying this. Jack rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on the knife. He wasn't going down without a fight. Nira grabbed his sleeve. Her voice was small, desperate. Jack, we can't fight it. Jack didn't answer. He knew she was right. The beast charged. Jack reacted instantly. He shoved Nira aside and dove forward, slashing out with the knife. The blade scraped against the creature's armor, barely making a mark. The beast swung a massive claw, and Jack barely dodged, rolling across the dirt. It was too strong. Jack gritted his teeth. He needed to be faster, smarter. The beast lunged again. And Nira moved. She darted behind it, quicker than Jack expected, grabbing a loose rock from the ground and hurling it at the creature's head. It smacked against its skull, making the beast snarl in annoyance. Jack saw his opening. He rushed forward, plunging the knife into the beast's leg. This time, it sank in. The monster roared in fury, swinging wildly. Jack barely let go in time, stumbling backward as the beast thrashed. It was angry now. Good. Jack's mind worked fast. It wasn't just about killing it. It was about surviving. And there was only one way to do that. He glanced at the canyon, then at the beast. A reckless, insane idea formed in his mind. The final push. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead. His voice was calm but urgent. Nira. She looked at him, still breathless. What? Jack gestured to the canyon's edge. We're gonna make it fall. Nira's eyes widened. What? How? Jack took a step toward the beast. We make it charge. Nira swallowed. The canyon was wide, but the edge was loose, unstable. If they could bait it just right, it could fall. But that meant putting themselves right in its path. Jack took a deep breath. No room for hesitation now. He whistled sharply. Hey, ugly. The beast snapped its head toward him, growling. Jack grinned. Come get me. The monster falls. The beast charged. Jack ran straight for the canyon edge. Nira hesitated, but then she followed. Jack's pulse thundered. This had to work. At the last second, Jack and Nira dove sideways. The beast couldn't stop in time. It tried to dig its claws into the rock, but the edge gave way beneath its weight. For a brief, horrible second, it hung there, claws scrambling for a grip. Then, it fell. A deep, echoing roar of rage filled the canyon as the beast disappeared into the abyss. Jack lay on his back, panting. His hands were shaking. Nira crawled forward, peering over the edge. The beast was gone. She turned to Jack, her silver eyes wide. Did we win? Jack exhaled, sitting up. He looked at the crumbling edge, at the silent canyon below. Then, finally, he let out a breathless laugh. Yeah, he muttered. We won. But something in the back of his mind whispered, did we? The final stand. Silence settled over the canyon like a heavy fog. The only sound was the wind, howling through the jagged rocks, carrying the ghost of the monster's last furious roar. The predator was gone, swallowed by the abyss. Jack sat on the rocky ground, breathing hard, his hands shaking from exhaustion. His body ached, bruises forming beneath torn fabric. His shotgun was empty, his knives were either lost or useless, and his energy was drained. But they were alive. Nira knelt a few feet away, still staring over the edge. Her silver eyes flickered with disbelief, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Could it really be over? Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, exhaling. That was insane. Nira slowly turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. We actually did it. Jack smirked, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, we did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night stretched around them, stars watching from above, the air filled with the scent of blood and burned wood. Jack glanced back toward the wreckage of the forest, smoke still rising from the distant ruins of his cabin. His home, destroyed. Nira followed his gaze. Guilt flickered across her face. I'm sorry. Jack shook his head. Don't be. He gave her a tired smirk. I never liked that place anyway. She let out a weak chuckle, then winced, her wound still fresh, her body still weak. Jack sighed. We need to patch you up. Nira nodded, but then a sound, a deep, low rumble. Jack's body went rigid. Nira's eyes widened. No. Jack turned, heart pounding. He slowly crept toward the canyon's edge, peering down into the abyss, and his stomach dropped. Far below, where the darkness swallowed the canyon floor, something moved. Rocks shifted. Then, a claw emerged. Jack cursed under his breath. The beast wasn't dead. It was climbing back up. A race against time. Jack spun toward Nira. Get up. She blinked, confused. What? Jack's voice turned sharp. Now, it's coming back. Nira's breath hitched. No, we made it fall. It's dead. Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her up. Not dead enough. She stumbled, wincing as pain shot through her side. But fear was stronger than exhaustion now. Jack's mind raced. They had barely survived the first fight. Now they were out of weapons, out of plans. And the beast was coming back. Nira clenched her fists, her voice trembling. What do we do? Jack stared at the canyon. His mind screamed that there was no way out. Then, he saw it. A few feet away, a cluster of loose rocks, barely hanging onto the canyon's edge. An idea sparked in his mind. Jack turned to Nira, his expression serious. We don't kill it. She frowned. Then what? Jack pointed to the unstable rocks. We bury it. The final trap. Nira's eyes flickered with understanding. We trigger a landslide. Jack nodded. If we can knock those rocks loose, we can send the whole ledge down on top of it, crush it for good. But how? Nira asked, scanning their surroundings. Jack exhaled. We make it come to us. Nira swallowed hard. You mean we let it climb back up? Jack met her gaze. Unless you got a better idea. She didn't. They had seconds to act. Jack hurried to the loose rock cluster, testing the ground beneath it. It was unstable, but not weak enough to fall on its own. He grabbed a long, heavy branch from the forest floor. It wasn't much, but if they used it as a lever. Another deep, rumbling growl. Jack turned. The beast's clawed hands gripped the canyon's edge. Its armored body was dragging itself up, dust and rock crumbling beneath it. Jack's blood ran cold. Its eyes glowed brighter than before. Fury, hunger, vengeance. It was angry now. Jack glanced at Nira. Be ready. She nodded, stepping closer to the rocks, her hands trembling. Tell me when. Jack faced the beast. He had to buy them time. He took a deep breath and did something reckless. He walked toward it. The beast let out a deep snarl, its claws digging into the earth. It was almost fully out of the canyon now. Jack raised his hands. "That all you got?" The beast roared. It lunged. Jack jumped back, narrowly avoiding a swipe that could have split him in half. "Now, Mira." She shoved the branch under the rock pile and pushed with all her strength. The rocks shifted, but they didn't fall. Not enough. Jack turned back. The beast was fully out of the canyon now. Nira cried out, "It's not working." Jack didn't hesitate. He threw himself against the rock pile, using his full weight to push. The ground shook. The beast charged. Jack roared, shoving with everything he had. And the earth gave way. Buried beneath the canyon, the entire cliffside collapsed. The beast's eyes widened in surprise. It dug its claws into the ground, but there was nothing to hold on to. Jack barely had time to jump back before the ground beneath the predator disappeared. A deafening rumble filled the air. Tons of rock and debris tumbled into the canyon, swallowing the beast in an avalanche of stone. Jack and Nira fell back, gasping for breath, as the dust rose around them. For a long moment, nothing moved. The ground was still. Nira stared at the ruined edge, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did we?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He crawled forward, peering into the abyss. The canyon was filled with rubble. No glowing eyes. No movement. The beast was gone. Jack sat back, exhaling. His lips curled into a tired, satisfied smirk. Now we won. Nira let out a breathless laugh, half from relief, half from exhaustion. They did it. The monster was dead. But as Jack looked at the endless forest ahead, one thought lingered in his mind. If this was here, what else was out there? Hope and survival. The dust had not yet settled. The air was thick with the scent of crushed rock, burned wood, and the metallic tang of blood, both Nira's and Jack's. The ground where they sat trembled no more. The monster was buried beneath the canyon. Jack leaned back against a fallen tree, his chest rising and falling heavily. His muscles ached, his ribs throbbed from where he'd slammed into the rocks. But they were alive. Across from him, Nira sat motionless, staring at the rubble where the predator had once stood. Her silver skin was stained with dirt, her clothes torn, her fingers still clutching the bloody knife Jack had given her. She looked small, worn, but alive. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and gave a tired chuckle. Well, that was a hell of a night. Nira finally turned to look at him, her glowing blue veins pulsing faintly in the dim moonlight. She exhaled a shaky breath and nodded. Yeah, it was. A long silence stretched between them. Jack let his head fall back, staring at the vast night sky above them. The stars were endless, burning bright and cold. Somewhere out there, beyond this forgotten world, civilizations thrived, wars raged, and people lived their lives. But here, it was just them. Just a broken human and a lost alien girl, the only two survivors of this nightmare. Jack sighed, finally breaking the silence. So, what now? Nowhere left to go. Nira blinked at him. What? Jack gestured vaguely toward the wreckage of his cabin in the distance. My home's gone. My supplies are either burned, broken, or buried under that thing's ugly corpse. He winced, rolling his sore shoulder. And I'm guessing you didn't exactly have a backup plan either. Nira lowered her gaze. He was right. She had barely been holding on before she met him. She had been running, lost and desperate, with no destination in mind, only the desperate hope of survival. Now, she had nothing. Her people were gone. She had no ship, no way off this planet, no allies. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small. I don't know. Jack watched her for a long moment. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had no one. He exhaled and ran a hand through his messy hair. All right, he muttered, pushing himself to his feet with a grunt. We'll figure it out. Nira glanced up at him, confused. We? Jack raised an eyebrow. You planning on surviving out here alone? She hesitated. I didn't think. Jack shook his head. Don't think. Just listen. You stick with me, you stay alive. Her glowing eyes studied him carefully, as if searching for deception. But there was none. Jack sighed. Look, kid, I don't do charity, and I sure as hell ain't a babysitter. But I've been alone a long time. He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe too long. Nira stared at him for a moment before something softened in her expression. A quiet understanding passed between them. She nodded. Okay. Jack smirked. Good choice. One step at a time. He rolled his shoulders and scanned the area. First things first. We need supplies, he said, pointing toward the distant wreckage. Some of my stuff might still be usable. Weapons, food, maybe even a med kit. Nira looked doubtful. That fire destroyed most of it. Jack shrugged. Then we salvage what we can. Nira sighed, clearly still sore, but stood up anyway. Her legs wobbled slightly, but she caught herself. Jack watched her with an approving nod. Tough little thing, aren't you? She gave him a tired glare. You have no idea. Jack chuckled. I think I'm starting to. Returning to the ashes, they walked carefully back through the forest, moving toward what little remained of the cabin. The once sturdy structure was now a charred skeleton. The walls collapsed, smoke still curling from the embers. Jack whistled low. Well, that's depressing. Nira looked around cautiously. Is it safe? Jack kicked over a fallen beam, scanning the rubble. Safer than the last time we were here. They searched the wreckage in silence, picking through the ashes and debris. Jack found his backup knife, still sharp. Good. Nira pulled out a half-burned ration pack and sniffed it. Less good. Jack made a face. Don't eat that. She dropped it with disgust. They continued searching until Jack froze. Nira saw his expression change. What is it? Jack reached into the rubble and pulled out a metal case. It was scorched but still intact. With careful hands, he flipped it open. Inside, nestled among various small supplies, was a radio transmitter. It was damaged but not completely broken. Jack stared at it, then slowly smiled. Well, kid, he murmured, holding it up. We might just have a way off this rock. The future awaits. Nira's breath hitched. You mean? Jack nodded. If I can fix this, we can send out a signal. Maybe call in a ride. Hope flickered in Nira's chest. A way off this world. A future beyond running and surviving. Jack glanced at her. You ever been to a human colony? She hesitated. No. He grinned. You're in for a hell of a ride. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nira smiled. They had won. They had survived. And now, they had a future to fight for. Jack slung the metal case over his shoulder, cracking his sore neck. Simon, partner. He smirked. Let's go see what the universe has to offer. Nira followed him. And together, they walked toward the rising sun.